The dusty schoolhouse at the edge of Yreka, California stood like a weathered sentinel against the unforgiving landscape. And inside its walls, Rebecca Norton counted the meager coins that constituted her monthly wages while trying to decide which of her students would go hungry if she did not help them. The year was 1873, and the small mining town had seen better days. The gold rush that had brought prosperity 2 decades earlier had dwindled to a trickle, leaving behind families struggling to survive on dreams that had turned to dust. Rebecca had arrived in Yreka 6 months ago from Sacramento, responding to an advertisement for a schoolteacher that promised modest pay and a place to stay. What the advertisement had not mentioned was the poverty that gripped most of the families, the children who came to school with hollow cheeks and worn shoes that let in the cold mountain air. She sat at her desk as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the empty classroom. The children had left an hour ago, their voices still echoing in her memory. Timothy Walsh, age 8, had tried to hide that he had brought no lunch again. Sarah and Emma Patterson, sisters aged 9 and 7, wore dresses so thin Rebecca could see their skin through the fabric. And then there was young Michael Chen, the son of a Chinese immigrant who worked at the dyeing mine, whose father sent him to school despite the prejudice he faced because education was the one thing that could lift his son from poverty. Rebecca spread the coins across her desk. $20. That was what the school board paid her each month. From this, she paid $5 for her room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house and another $1 for basic necessities. That left $14, which should have been enough to save for the future she had once dreamed of. But looking at those coins, all she could see were the faces of her students. She began separating the money into small piles. The Walsh family needed help the most, with 6 children and a father who had been injured in a mining accident. She set aside $3 for them. The Patterson girls lived with their widowed mother who took in laundry but could barely afford to feed them. $2. The Chen family faced discrimination that made finding steady work nearly impossible. $2. There were others too, smaller amounts tucked into envelopes she would slip discreetly into lunch pails and coat pockets where the children would find them, preserving their dignity even as she helped them survive. When she finished, she had kept only $6 for herself. It was not the first time. Every month since she had arrived, Rebecca had given away more than half her wages. Mrs. Henderson had been patient about the rent, accepting whatever Rebecca could pay and extending credit for the rest. Rebecca knew she was accumulating debt, but whenever she thought about keeping more for herself, she remembered the sound of a child's stomach growling during lessons, or the sight of Timothy Walsh sharing his meager piece of bread with his younger sister. What Rebecca did not know was that someone had been watching her acts of quiet charity, piecing together the evidence of her generosity from careful observation, and the loose lips of townsfolk who noticed more than they let on. Daniel Sawyer rode into Yreka on a Thursday afternoon, his horse tired from the journey up from the valley. He was a cowboy by trade, though that simple word did not capture the complexity of the man. At 26 years old, he had spent the last 8 years working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, saving his money with the careful discipline of someone who had known poverty and refused to return to it. He had recently purchased a small ranch 10 miles outside of Yreka, a modest spread with good grazing land and water rights that had cost him most of his savings. His plan was simple: build up a herd, live frugally, and create something lasting. Daniel was a tall man, lean from hard work, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and gray eyes that noticed everything. He had learned young that survival depended on observation, on reading situations and people before they revealed their true nature. His father had died when he was 12, leaving him to help his mother raise 4 younger siblings. He had worked every job available to a boy, then a young man, sending money home until his siblings were grown and his mother had remarried a decent man who could provide for her. He had come to town for supplies, but also for information. Running a ranch alone was difficult, and he needed to hire help. He also needed to understand the community he had joined. Yreka was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and Daniel had spent his first weeks learning who could be trusted, who held grudges, and where the fault lines of local politics lay. He had noticed the schoolteacher on his previous visits to town. It was hard not to notice her. Rebecca Norton carried herself with a quiet dignity that stood out in a rough mining town. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with auburn hair she wore pinned up in a practical style, and brown eyes that seemed to see more than most people realized. She was pretty in an understated way that became more apparent the longer you looked at her. But what had really caught Daniel's attention was the way she interacted with the children. He had seen her in the mercantile, carefully selecting penny candy and claiming it was for herself, then somehow forgetting it where the Walsh children would find it. He had watched her mend clothes at the boarding house, garments far too small to be hers, which she returned discreetly to students whose families could not afford to repair them. And he had overheard Mrs. Henderson mention to another boarder that the schoolteacher was behind on rent again, though she had paid for the Chen boys' shoes at the cobbler just last week. Daniel had not said anything then. He had learned that observing and understanding came before action. But as the pattern became clear, he found himself thinking about Rebecca Norton more than was probably wise. He thought about her generosity, her discretion in preserving her students' dignity, her willingness to sacrifice her own security for children who were not hers. In a world where most people looked out only for themselves, she stood as a reminder that goodness still existed. It was Tommy Walsh, age 14 and old enough to work odd jobs, who finally gave Daniel the full picture. The boy had come looking for work at the ranch, willing to do anything for a few coins to bring home. While they worked together mending fence posts, Tommy had talked about his teacher. "Miss Norton is the best teacher we ever had," Tommy had said, hammering a post into the hard ground. "She actually cares if we learn, and she does not look down on us for being poor, not like some folks in town." "She seems like a good teacher," Daniel had replied, holding the post steady. "She is more than that, Mr. Sawyer. She helps us. I should not say nothing, because I think she wants it secret, but my ma knows. The money that shows up in our house in pockets and such, that is Miss Norton. She gives away her pay to families that need it." Tommy had looked embarrassed then, as if he had revealed too much. "Ma says we should not accept charity, but Pa cannot work since the accident and there are so many mouths to feed. Miss Norton, she makes it so it does not feel like charity. Like maybe we earned it somehow or it is just luck, but Ma counts the money and she knows." Daniel had paid Tommy well for his work and sent him home with extra, which the boy had accepted with the careful pride of someone who understood the difference between earning and begging. But Tommy's words had stayed with Daniel, confirming what he had suspected. Rebecca Norton was giving away her future to feed other people's children. That night, Daniel had sat on the porch of his small ranch house, looking out at the dark shapes of the few cattle he had managed to purchase, and thought about what kind of person gave until they had nothing left. He thought about his own journey, how he had worked himself nearly to death to climb out of poverty. He had done it for his family, but also for himself. He had wanted security, stability, the knowledge that he would never again be that 12-year-old boy terrified that his mother and siblings would starve. He had achieved that security through careful planning and ruthless discipline. Every dollar had been accounted for, every decision weighed against his long-term goals. He had not given to charity, had not helped beyond what directly benefited him. He had told himself it was necessary, that he needed to establish himself first, that someday when he was truly secure he would think about others. But Rebecca Norton was not secure. She was accumulating debt, living on the edge of poverty herself, and still she gave. It shamed him in a way. It also fascinated him. What kind of strength did it take to live that way? What kind of faith in humanity, or in God, or in whatever she believed in, allowed her to give without counting the cost? Daniel was not a religious man, though he respected those who were. His faith had been worn down by hard years and harder lessons. But watching Rebecca, hearing about her quiet acts of generosity, he felt something stir in him that might have been the memory of faith, or perhaps just recognition that here was someone who lived according to principles he had once believed in, but had set aside as impractical. The next day, he had ridden into town with a plan forming in his mind. He was not entirely sure what he intended to do, only that doing nothing no longer felt acceptable. He found himself at the mercantile, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but really to ask questions. Walter Price, who owned the mercantile, was a garrulous man who loved to talk. "That schoolteacher, Miss Norton," he said in response to Daniel's casual inquiry. "Fine woman. Pays her bills here when she can, though she is often short. I extend her credit because she is good for it eventually. Not like some folks who run up debts and skip town. She always makes it right." "I heard she helps some of the students," Daniel said, examining a coil of rope he did not need. Walter nodded. "More than helps, near about keeps some of those families fed. The Walshes, definitely. The Patterson girls. That Chinese boy, though some folks in town do not like her being so friendly with the Chinese. I say it is her business. The boy is polite and smart, and his daddy works hard at that played-out mine for barely nothing." "Where does she get the money if she is behind on her bills?" Daniel asked. "From what she should be using to pay those bills," Walter said with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "I told her once she needed to take care of herself first, and she smiled real sweet and said the children could not wait for her to be secure because they were hungry now. What do you say to that?" Daniel had not known what to say then either. He had purchased his supplies and left, but the conversation had solidified his resolve. Rebecca Norton was going to run herself into complete ruin if someone did not intervene. The question was how to help without insulting her or interfering with what was clearly important work to her. The answer came to him that evening, and by the next afternoon, he had set his plan in motion. Rebecca was locking up the schoolhouse for the weekend, her arms full of copybooks she planned to review over the next 2 days, when she noticed a man standing near the building. She recognized him as Daniel Sawyer, the cowboy who had bought the old Morrison ranch. She had seen him in town a few times, a quiet presence who watched more than he spoke. Something about his attention made her nervous, though she could not have said why. "Mr. Sawyer," she said politely, shifting the copybooks in her arms. "Can I help you with something?" He removed his hat, and she noticed he had kind eyes despite their serious expression. "Miss Norton, I hope I am not disturbing you. I wanted to speak with you about a matter of some importance." Her heart sank. Someone had found out about the money she had been giving to students. Perhaps a parent had complained or the school board had discovered her unorthodox methods. She straightened her spine, preparing to defend her actions. "Of course. What is this about?" "I have been working my ranch alone since I purchased it," Daniel said. "It is too much for one man. I need help, but I cannot yet afford to hire a full-time hand. I was hoping we might come to an arrangement." Rebecca blinked, confused. "I am not sure I understand what this has to do with me." "I need someone to help with bookkeeping, record keeping, and correspondence with buyers and suppliers. A few hours a week in the evenings or on weekends. I could pay $5 a week for such help." $5. That was more than a quarter of her monthly wages, and for what sounded like minimal work. Rebecca was immediately suspicious. "Mr. Sawyer, I appreciate the offer, but I do not have experience with ranch bookkeeping. You are a teacher. You can read, write, and cipher better than most folks in this county. That is all I need." He met her eyes steadily. "I would also appreciate your discretion. I do not want it known around town that I need help with paperwork. Some folks might think it means the ranch is struggling, which could affect my credit and ability to do business." That last part made sense. Pride and reputation mattered in a small town, often more than the reality beneath them. Still, the offer seemed too generous. "Why me?" she asked. "Surely there are others who could do this work. You are educated, trustworthy, and I have been told you keep confidences." He paused. "And I suspect you could use the extra income." There it was. He knew. Maybe not the full extent of what she did, but he knew she was struggling financially. Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I manage fine with my teaching wages." "I am certain you do," Daniel said, and his tone was gentle without judgment. "But $5 extra a week would not hurt, would it? And I genuinely do need the help, Miss Norton. Ranch work takes all my daylight hours. I have been trying to keep the books at night by lamplight, and I am making mistakes that could cost me. I need someone with a clear head and good education to help me organize my records properly." Rebecca looked at him carefully. He seemed sincere, and what he asked was not unreasonable. Many ranchers hired help with paperwork, especially those trying to establish themselves. And $5 a week would mean so much more she could do for her students, or perhaps even begin paying down her debt at the boarding house. "When would you need me to start?" she heard herself ask. Relief crossed Daniel's face. "Would tomorrow afternoon be possible? I could come into town to fetch you, bring you out to the ranch for a few hours, and have you back before dark. Tomorrow is Saturday. I could spare the afternoon." She hesitated. "But I should tell you, Mr. Sawyer, my wages from teaching are not always available. There are expenses that arise. If you are offering this work because you think I need charity, I would prefer you be honest about it." Daniel shook his head. "This is not charity, Miss Norton. I need help, and I am willing to pay for it. How you spend the money you earn is your business, but I will tell you that I respect what you do with your teaching wages. It takes a rare kind of person to give like that." So he did know. Rebecca was not sure whether to be embarrassed or relieved. "The children need it more than I do." "Perhaps," Daniel said, "but you need to survive too. Even the most generous person cannot give from an empty hand." It was the same thing Mrs. Henderson had told her, and what Walter Price had hinted at, but somehow hearing it from this serious cowboy struck differently. There was no judgment in his voice, no criticism of her choices, just a practical observation. "I will see you tomorrow afternoon then," Rebecca said. Daniel nodded, replaced his hat, and walked away toward where his horse was tied. Rebecca watched him go, still not entirely sure what had just happened, but feeling something shift in her world. True to his word, Daniel arrived at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house the next afternoon driving a small wagon. Rebecca had dressed in her simplest work dress, uncertain what ranch life might entail, and had told Mrs. Henderson where she was going. The older woman had given her a knowing look, but said nothing beyond wishing her a pleasant afternoon. The ride to the ranch took about 40 minutes, winding through foothills covered in dry grass and scattered oak trees. The landscape was beautiful in its stark way, and Daniel pointed out landmarks and property lines as they rode. He talked about his plans for the ranch, his hope to build up a quality herd rather than running a large operation, and his belief that the market would favor those who raised better cattle even if they raised fewer of them. Rebecca found herself relaxing as he talked. Daniel had an easy way of speaking, not filling silence with meaningless chatter but sharing genuine thoughts and ideas. He asked her opinion on things, seeming genuinely interested in her answers. When she mentioned she had grown up on a small farm in the Central Valley, he asked questions about crops and soil, drawing connections between farming and ranching that showed an educated mind behind the cowboy exterior. The ranch house was small but well built, a two-room structure with a porch facing west toward the mountains. The barn and outbuildings were in good repair, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. It was modest but cared for, the property of a man building something with his own hands. Daniel showed her into the house, which was surprisingly neat for a bachelor residence. A table near the window served as a desk, and it was covered in papers, receipts, and ledger books. "I apologize for the mess," he said. "I have been trying to organize it, but I am afraid I have made it worse." Rebecca surveyed the chaos and felt something settle in her chest. This was real work, genuine work that needed doing. However generous his motives for hiring her might be, he had not exaggerated his need for help. She set down her shawl and rolled up her sleeves. "Show me what system you have been trying to use, and we will see if we can make sense of it." They worked through the afternoon, Rebecca organizing the papers into categories, creating a filing system that would allow Daniel to find information quickly. She set up ledgers for income and expenses, for cattle records, and for correspondence with buyers. Daniel provided information as she asked for it, and she began to see the shape of his operation. He was careful with money, sometimes frugal to the point of denying himself comforts. He paid his debts promptly, sometimes early. He researched markets before making decisions. Everything she saw spoke of discipline and long-term thinking. Yet he had hired her at a generous wage for work he could probably have struggled through himself. As the afternoon wore toward evening, Rebecca sat back from the now organized desk and smiled. "That should make things more manageable. If you keep the receipts in these folders as they come in and update the ledgers weekly, you should be able to see at a glance how the ranch is doing." "This is excellent work," Daniel said, examining the neat rows of labeled folders and the clearly marked ledgers. "You have a gift for organization." "I am a teacher. Organization is survival," Rebecca said with a laugh. Then she looked at him directly. "But Mr. Sawyer, this is perhaps 3 hours of work a week at most once the initial organization is done. You are offering to pay me $5 for that." Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "I value good work and I pay fairly for it. Besides, there will be other tasks. Letters to write, records to analyze, decisions that benefit from another perspective. You are educated in ways I am not, Miss Norton. That education has value." "You are educated yourself," Rebecca said. "You have read widely, I can tell from how you speak. This is not about my education." "No," Daniel admitted. "It is not entirely about that, but neither is it charity. I do need your help and I will pay you for it. How you choose to spend that money is your affair. If it allows you to help more students or to pay down your debts or to save for your own future, that is your decision to make." Rebecca stood and walked to the window, looking out at the cattle grazing in the golden late afternoon light. "Why are you doing this? You do not know me. We have barely spoken before yesterday." Daniel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I know what you do for your students. I know you give until you have nothing left." I know that in a town where most people are focused on their own survival, you have decided that children's hunger matters more than your own security." He paused. "I spent years focused only on my own survival and my family's needs. I did what I had to do, and I do not regret it. But I also did not think beyond that. Watching what you do, learning about your generosity, it made me realize I have reached a point where I can do more than just survive. I can help someone who is helping others." Rebecca turned to look at him. "You said you had siblings. Did you support them?" "4 younger siblings after my father died. I was 12. I worked every job I could find, sent money home until they were grown. My mother remarried when I was 16, a good man who took care of them, but by then the pattern was set. I worked, I saved, I sent money. I did it for 8 more years, until I had enough to buy this place." "Then you understand," Rebecca said softly. "You cannot watch people you care about struggle when you have even a little to share." "I do understand. But I also know that I could not have kept helping my family if I had not taken care of my own basic needs. You cannot teach children if you are thrown out of your lodging for unpaid rent, Miss Norton. You cannot help anyone if you destroy yourself in the process." He was right, and Rebecca knew it. She had been pushing the limits of her own survival, telling herself that one more month, one more payment to a struggling family, would not matter. But the debt at the boarding house was growing, and winter was coming when expenses would increase. "I will accept your offer," she said. "But I want you to know that I see what you are doing. This is as much about helping me as it is about ranch bookkeeping." "Then we understand each other," Daniel said. "And perhaps that is a good foundation for working together." He drove her back to town as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They talked about books they had read, about the changes coming to California, about the challenges facing small communities like Yreka. Rebecca found herself genuinely enjoying his company, appreciating his thoughtful observations and dry humor. When he dropped her at the boarding house, he handed her an envelope. "Your wages for today. I will collect you next Saturday at the same time if that suits you." Rebecca took the envelope, feeling the weight of coins inside. "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer, for the work and for your discretion." "Daniel," he said, "if we are going to work together regularly, you might as well use my given name, and I will call you Rebecca if I may." "You may," she said, and surprised herself by smiling. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Rebecca." She watched him drive away, then went inside and opened the envelope in the privacy of her room. $5 in silver coins, honest wages for honest work. She counted out what she needed for Mrs. Henderson, set aside a small amount for herself, and began planning how the rest could help her students. That night, she lay in bed thinking about Daniel Sawyer. He was not what she had expected. Cowboys were supposed to be rough, uneducated men concerned only with their work and their next drink. But Daniel was thoughtful, well-read, and capable of seeing beyond his own needs. He had built himself up from poverty through discipline and hard work, yet somehow retained the ability to empathize with those still struggling. She thought about his gray eyes, how they seemed to notice everything. She thought about his hands, scarred and calloused from hard work but gentle when he handled papers or tools. She thought about his voice, quiet but confident, and the way he listened when she spoke as if her words genuinely mattered to him. These thoughts made her uncomfortable. Rebecca had not come to Yreka looking for romance. At 23, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood, assuming that any man who might have courted her would be put off by her education or her lack of a dowry. She had poured herself into teaching, into helping her students, and told herself it was enough. But working beside Daniel, talking with him, seeing the kind of man he was, something in her had awakened. She pushed the feeling aside, telling herself it was merely gratitude for his help and respect for his character. There was no reason to think he saw her as anything more than a useful employee. No reason to imagine those gray eyes might hold warmth beyond professional regard. Still, as she drifted toward sleep, her last thoughts were of the afternoon spent organizing papers in the golden light of the ranch house, and the surprising pleasure of working alongside someone who seemed to understand not just what she did, but why she did it. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable pattern. Rebecca taught during the week, continuing to share her wages with students who needed help. But now, with the additional income from Daniel, she could also begin to pay down her debt to Mrs. Henderson and put aside a small emergency fund. The weight of constant financial anxiety eased slightly, allowing her to breathe more freely. Every Saturday afternoon, Daniel would collect her and drive her to the ranch. The bookkeeping work was real, if not terribly time-consuming once she had established systems. But they fell into the habit of her staying for supper, which Daniel would prepare with surprising competence, and then talking on the porch as the sun set before he drove her back to town. During these conversations, Rebecca learned more about the man Daniel Sawyer was. He had been born in Missouri, moved west with his family during the tail end of the gold rush. His father had not been a miner but a merchant, trying to sell supplies to those seeking fortune. When his father died, the family had lost everything, and Daniel's mother had moved them to Sacramento where she could find work as a seamstress. I promised myself I would never be that vulnerable again, Daniel told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the cattle. Not having money, not being able to protect my family, it changes you, makes you hard maybe, makes you focus on survival above everything else. But you helped your family, Rebecca pointed out. That is not hard, that is love. Maybe, or maybe it was control. If I earned the money, I could make sure we survived. I could not trust anyone else to care as much as I did. Rebecca considered this. And now, you have your ranch, you are established. Do you still feel that need for control? Daniel was quiet for a moment. I did until recently. Buying this place, it was supposed to be the end goal. Security, stability, something I could not lose. But then I watched you giving away your security to help children who were not your responsibility, and I realized how small my vision had been. I had focused so much on protecting what I had that I forgot about anything beyond survival. You are being too hard on yourself, Rebecca said. You worked hard to build something. There is no shame in that. No, but there is no glory in it either, not compared to what you do. He looked at her then, his gray eyes serious. You remind me that there are things more important than security, things worth risking comfort for. The intensity of his gaze made Rebecca's heart beat faster. She looked away toward the darkening mountains. I only do what needs to be done. The children are hungry now. They cannot wait for me to be secure before I help them. I know. That is what makes you remarkable. Rebecca did not know what to say to that. She changed the subject, asking about his plans for winter, and the moment passed. But his words stayed with her, warming something deep inside that had been cold for too long. As October turned toward November, the relationship between them deepened. It was not deliberate, not something either of them planned, but rather a natural growing together of two people who understood each other in fundamental ways. Daniel began to share his real struggles with the ranch, asking Rebecca's opinion on decisions beyond bookkeeping. She found herself talking about her students, her frustrations with parents who did not value education, her dreams of perhaps one day opening a school that could provide not just learning but meals and clothing for students who needed them. You could do it, Daniel said when she mentioned this dream. If you could find backers, support from the community, You could create something that lasted beyond your own teaching years. It is just a dream, Rebecca said. I can barely manage to help a few students now. How could I possibly fund an entire charitable school? Dreams start small. You started with one student, one family. It grew from there. Who is to say it could not grow more? His faith in her was intoxicating. Rebecca had grown up being told that women should be content with modest ambitions, that dreams of changing the world were inappropriate for her sex. Her mother had been disappointed when she insisted on attending normal school to become a teacher instead of focusing on finding a husband. But Daniel spoke to her as an equal, treated her ideas with respect, encouraged her to think bigger than she had dared in turn. Rebecca found herself helping Daniel see beyond the narrow focus of survival that had governed his life for so long. She encouraged him to connect more with the community, to attend town meetings and church socials, to build relationships beyond pure business transactions. She pointed out that his ranch would be more secure if he was part of the social fabric of Yreka, not just a solitary figure on the outskirts. Daniel took her advice and slowly began to integrate himself into town life. He helped repair the church roof after a storm. He donated beef to a community dinner. He hired Tommy Walsh and several other young men from struggling families for seasonal work, paying them fairly and treating them with respect. The town began to see him not as a newcomer or an outsider, but as one of them. And the town began to notice how Daniel Sawyer and Rebecca Norton looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. Mrs. Henderson was the first to comment, catching Rebecca in the parlor one evening after Daniel had dropped her off. "That cowboy is courting you," the older woman said with satisfaction. "About time someone appreciated what you do." "He is not courting me," Rebecca protested. "I work for him doing bookkeeping for his ranch." "Oh, is that what they are calling it now?" Mrs. Henderson laughed. "Dear girl, I have eyes. The way that man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars, that is not how an employer looks at an employee." Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You are imagining things." "Am I? Well, you tell yourself that if it comforts you. But mark my words, Daniel Sawyer is falling in love with you, if he has not already fallen." Rebecca retreated to her room, flustered and uncertain. Was it possible? Did Daniel have feelings for her beyond respect and friendship? She thought about the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the way he found excuses to extend their time together, the care he took in preparing meals when she visited the ranch. She thought about how her heart lifted when she saw him, how his praise mattered more than anyone else's, how she had begun to think of the ranch as a haven, a place where she could be herself without judgment. Could it be that she was falling in love with him? The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Rebecca had never been in love before. She had assumed it was something that would pass her by, that her life would be dedicated to teaching and helping others without the complications of romance. But Daniel had slipped past her defenses without her noticing, and now she could not imagine her weeks without their Saturday afternoons together, their conversations on his porch, the quiet comfort of working alongside him. But what if Mrs. Henderson was wrong? What if Daniel saw her only as a friend and employee, and she had read more into his kindness than he intended? The humiliation of revealing feelings that were not returned kept her silent, letting weeks pass without saying anything that might change the comfortable relationship they had built. Daniel, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle. He had fallen in love with Rebecca Norton, completely and irrevocably, and had no idea how to tell her. He had never courted a woman before. His youth had been consumed by work and responsibility, leaving no time for romance. Now, at 26, he found himself as uncertain as a boy when it came to matters of the heart. He talked about it with Tommy Walsh one afternoon while they mended fences. The boy was nearly 15 now, stronger and more capable than when he had first come looking for work. Daniel had hired him regularly, and Tommy had proven himself reliable and hardworking. "You should just tell Miss Norton how you feel," Tommy said with the confidence of youth. "She likes you, anyone can see that." "What if I am wrong?" Daniel said. "What if she values our friendship and I ruin it by wanting more?" "Then you ruin it," Tommy said pragmatically. "But at least you will know. Seems to me that not knowing and always wondering would be worse than knowing and being disappointed." Daniel had to admit the boy had a point. But fear kept him silent, the same fear that kept Rebecca from speaking. Two people circling each other, both afraid to risk what they had for what they wanted. The situation came to a head in mid-November during a fierce storm that swept through the mountains. Rebecca had come to the ranch on Saturday as usual, but the storm hit harder and faster than anyone had anticipated. The temperature dropped dramatically and the rain turned to sleet, then snow. Within an hour, the roads had become impassable. Daniel looked out at the blinding white and made a decision. "You cannot go back tonight. The road to town would be suicide in this weather. You will have to stay here until it clears." Rebecca's heart pounded. Staying overnight at a bachelor's ranch would be considered scandalous, but she could see he was right. The storm was worsening, and attempting the drive would be dangerous. "I suppose I have no choice, but I will need to get word to Mrs. Henderson so she does not worry." "The storm will be worried about long before we could get a message through," Daniel said. "But the whole town will know no one could travel in this weather. Your reputation will survive one forced night of shelter." He gave her his bedroom, insisting he would sleep on the floor in the main room near the stove. Rebecca protested, but he was adamant. She lay in his bed, surrounded by his scent, listening to the howl of wind and the creak of the house, and wondered what the morning would bring. She must have dozed because she woke suddenly to darkness and bitter cold. The fire had gone out. She could hear Daniel moving in the other room and called out, "Daniel, is everything all right?" "The stove went out," he called back. "The wind must have blown down the chimney. I am trying to get it relit, but the wood is cold. This may take a while." Rebecca wrapped a blanket around herself and emerged from the bedroom. Even inside, she could see her breath in the air. Daniel was working at the stove, trying to coax flames from reluctant kindling. "Let me help," she said, kneeling beside him. Together they worked, feeding small pieces of dry wood, protecting the fragile flame until it caught and began to grow. Slowly, warmth began to return to the room. They stayed near the stove, both wrapped in blankets, waiting for the house to warm enough to risk sleeping again. The forced proximity, the darkness lit only by the glow from the stove, created an intimacy that stripped away pretense. "Rebecca," Daniel said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" "I did not hire you just for bookkeeping. I mean, I do need the help, but that was not the real reason." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I hired you because I wanted a reason to spend time with you. I wanted to help you, yes, but also to know you. And the more I have known you, the more I have come to care for you." Rebecca could barely breathe. "Care for me? I am saying this badly," Daniel said with a frustrated laugh. "I have never done this before. What I am trying to say is that I have fallen in love with you, Rebecca. Deeply, completely in love. I love your generous heart, your dedication to your students, your intelligence and your kindness. I love how you see the best in people and work to bring it out. I love talking with you, working beside you, just being near you." He looked at her, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "I know I have nothing to offer but a struggling ranch and a future that is uncertain. I know you could probably do better than a cowboy who is barely educated and rough around the edges." But I had to tell you, even if you do not feel the same way." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "You think you are barely educated. Daniel, you are one of the most thoughtful, intelligent men I have ever met, and you think you have nothing to offer. You have shown me more genuine caring and respect than anyone else in my life. You see who I really am and value it, even the parts others think are foolish." "Then you do not think I am being foolish to hope?" Daniel asked softly. "No," Rebecca said, reaching out to take his hand. "Because I love you too. I have been so afraid to say it, afraid I was wrong about your feelings, afraid to risk our friendship. But I love you, Daniel Sawyer. I love your strength and your gentleness. I love how hard you have worked to build something good. I love how you have opened yourself to caring about more than just survival. I love who you are and who I am when I am with you." Daniel pulled her close, blankets and all, holding her as if she were something precious. "I was so afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you would laugh at the idea of a cowboy thinking he was good enough for a teacher. And I was afraid you saw me as just a charity case," Rebecca said. "Someone to help out of pity." "Never pity," Daniel said firmly. "Admiration, respect, and love, but never pity." They sat together by the stove as the storm raged outside, holding each other and talking until dawn began to lighten the sky. They talked about their fears and hopes, about the future they might build together, about how unexpected love was when it finally came. When the storm cleared the next afternoon and Daniel drove Rebecca back to town, they did so openly holding hands, no longer trying to hide what they felt. Mrs. Henderson took one look at them and smiled knowingly, asking no questions but making it clear that she approved. The town had its own opinions, of course. Some people thought it was romantic, the cowboy and the teacher falling in love. Others thought it was practical, two people with limited means joining forces to survive. A few raised eyebrows at the fact that Rebecca had spent a night at the ranch, even though everyone knew the storm had made travel impossible. Rebecca and Daniel did not care what people thought. They had found something rare and precious, and they were not going to let small-minded gossip diminish it. Daniel proposed 2 weeks later, in his characteristically straightforward way. They were sitting on his porch on a cold but clear Saturday afternoon, and he simply took her hand and said, "Rebecca, will you marry me? I know it will be a hard life sometimes, that the ranch might struggle and money might be tight, but I promise I will work every day to build a good life for us. I promise to support your dreams as you have supported mine. I promise to love you and stand beside you in whatever comes." "Yes," Rebecca said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." He pulled out a simple gold band he had commissioned from the town's jeweler. It was not fancy, but it was solid and real, like Daniel himself. Rebecca slipped it on her finger and felt her life shift into a new pattern, one that included not just helping others but accepting help, not just giving love but receiving it. They married in December, in the small church in Yreka with half the town attending. Mrs. Henderson cried happy tears. Tommy Walsh stood as Daniel's best man, proud to represent the families Rebecca had helped. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was tender and full of promise. Rebecca moved to the ranch, which meant giving up her teaching position. The school board would not employ a married woman, a rule that Rebecca found unjust but could not change. She was saddened to leave her students, but she promised the families she had been helping that she would not abandon them. Somehow, she would find a way to continue the work that mattered so much to her. Daniel, true to his word, supported her completely. "We will find a way," he said. "You have helped build something important in this community. We will not let it end just because you are no longer officially the teacher." They worked together to create a new approach. Rebecca began tutoring students in the evenings at the ranch, offering free lessons to children who were struggling. She organized a lending library, convincing families to donate books and circulating them among students who had no access to reading material. And with Daniel's help, she established what she called the Scholarship Fund, a small pool of money they set aside each month to help families with school expenses. The fund was modest, but it grew. Daniel donated a portion of his ranch profits. Other families in town, learning about what Rebecca and Daniel were doing, contributed what they could. Walter Price at the Mercantile donated school supplies. The cobbler agreed to repair students' shoes at a discount. What had started as one woman sharing her wages had grown into a community effort to ensure that poverty was not a barrier to education. Life on the ranch was not easy. The winters were harsh, and there were times when money was tight. But Rebecca had never been happier. She woke each morning beside a man who loved her deeply, who valued her intelligence and her generous heart. She worked hard, helping Daniel with the ranch, managing their household, and continuing her educational efforts in the community. It was a full life, sometimes exhausting but deeply satisfying. In the spring, she discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror. They were not wealthy, and a child would stretch their resources. But they were also excited to start a family, to build something together that went beyond land and cattle. "We will figure it out," Daniel said, holding her close. "We always do. And our child will grow up seeing what you do, how you help others. That is a gift worth more than gold." Their son was born in early winter, healthy and loud. They named him William Daniel Sawyer, though they called him Will from the start. He had Rebecca's brown eyes and Daniel's dark hair, and he changed everything. Being parents forced them to think even more carefully about the future, about the kind of community they wanted to raise their son in. It also deepened their commitment to helping others. They did not want Will to grow up in a town where children went hungry or were denied education because of poverty. As Will grew, Rebecca and Daniel watched him develop his own generous heart. He had grown up watching his mother tutor students, seeing his father hire young men who needed work. When he was old enough to understand, they told him about the scholarship fund and Rebecca's years of sharing her wages with students who needed help. "Why did you give away your money?" Will asked his mother when he was 7. "Because it was not really my money," Rebecca said. "Money is just a tool. What matters is what you do with it. I could have saved it for myself, but hungry children could not wait for me to be rich. They needed help then in that moment." "But did not you need help too?" Will asked. "I did," Rebecca admitted, "but I had enough to survive." "They did not. And then your father came along and helped me, which allowed me to help even more people. That is how it works, sweetheart. We help each other and the help multiplies." Will thought about this. "When I grow up, I want to help people too." "You already do," Daniel said, tousling his son's hair. "Every time you share with the other children, every time you stand up for someone who is being picked on, you are helping. You do not have to wait until you grow up to make a difference." The years passed with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Daniel's careful management and quality focus paid off. The ranch prospered, not making them wealthy but providing a comfortable living. They were able to expand the scholarship fund, help more families, and make a real difference in their community. When Will was 10, they had a daughter, Clara, who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's quick intelligence. She was a fierce little thing from the start, determined to keep up with her older brother and not to be left behind in anything. "She is going to change the world," Rebecca said, watching 3-year-old Clara demand that Will teach her to read just as he was learning. "She gets that from her mother," Daniel said with a smile. "The Sawyer women do not accept limitations." As their children grew, Rebecca and Daniel's love deepened. It was no longer the passionate discovery of those early days, but something richer and more complex. They had weathered hard times together, celebrated victories, supported each other through failures. They had built not just a ranch but a life, not just a family but a legacy of generosity. When Will was 18 and preparing to leave for university in Sacramento, something Rebecca and Daniel had saved years to make possible, he came to them with a question. "I want to study law," he said. "I want to be able to help people the way you have helped them, but on a bigger scale. I want to fight for laws that make it so families do not have to choose between eating and education." Is that foolish? Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. That is not foolish. That is magnificent. "We are proud of you," Daniel said. "More than you know. You are taking what we tried to do in our small corner of the world and expanding it. That is how change happens." After Will left for university, Rebecca and Daniel found themselves adjusting to a quieter household with just Clara at home. They were in their 40s now, no longer young but not yet old, with most of their lives still ahead of them. One evening, sitting on the porch as they had done so many times over the years, Rebecca reflected on their journey. "Do you remember that first day you came to the schoolhouse?" she asked. "When you offered me work as a bookkeeper," "I remember," Daniel said. "I was so nervous. I was certain you would see right through my excuse and turn me down." "I did see through it," Rebecca admitted. "But I needed the work, and I respected that you were trying to help without making it feel like charity." "It was never charity," Daniel said. "It was an investment in you, in the work you were doing, in the kind of community we could build together." He took her hand. "Best investment I ever made." "I fell in love with you that first day," Rebecca said softly. "I did not realize it then, but looking back I can see it. The way you saw me, really saw me and valued what I was trying to do. No one had ever done that before." "I fell in love with you before we ever spoke," Daniel admitted. "Watching you help your students, seeing your generous heart, I knew you were someone extraordinary. I just had to find a way to be part of your life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains just as they had done countless times before. The ranch around them was prosperous now, the herd strong, the buildings well maintained. But the real wealth was not in the land or the cattle. It was in the family they had built, the community they had helped strengthen, and the love that had grown between them over 20 years of marriage. Clara came out to join them, now 15 and as determined as ever. "Mother, Father, I have been thinking about what I want to do after I finish school." "What is that, sweetheart?" Rebecca asked. "I want to be a teacher like you were. But I want to open a school like the one you used to dream about, where students can get meals and clothes if they need them, where poverty is not a barrier to learning." She looked at them with shining eyes. "Will you help me?" Rebecca looked at Daniel, and they shared a smile. Their daughter had been listening all these years, absorbing the lessons they had tried to teach about generosity and compassion, and using your resources to help others. "Of course we will help you," Daniel said. "That is what family does." As Clara went back inside, excited to start planning her future, Rebecca leaned against Daniel's shoulder. "We did well," she said. "We did," he agreed. "Two children who want to help make the world better, a community that is stronger because of the work you started, and each other. I would say we did very well indeed." The years continued to unfold. Will graduated from university and began practicing law in Sacramento, where he focused on cases involving education rights and poverty law. He married a woman as passionate about justice as he was, and they had 3 children whom they raised with the same values Rebecca and Daniel had instilled in them. Clara achieved her dream, opening a school that provided not just education but meals, clothing, and medical care to students who needed it. She raised money from benefactors in San Francisco and Sacramento, arguing passionately that investing in education was investing in California's future. Her school became a model for others, and within 10 years, similar institutions had opened in several towns across the state. Rebecca and Daniel watched their children's achievements with pride, knowing that the small acts of generosity that had started years ago had rippled outward in ways they could never have anticipated. What had begun with a teacher sharing her meager wages with hungry students had grown into a family legacy of service and compassion. As they aged, they remained active in their community. Daniel served on the town council, advocating for policies that supported working families. Rebecca continued tutoring students and mentoring young teachers. They donated to scholarships, supported community programs, and opened their home to anyone who needed help or advice. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the town of Yreka held a celebration in their honor. It was not something they had wanted, both being naturally modest people, but the community insisted. At the celebration, person after person stood up to share stories of how Rebecca and Daniel had helped them. Tommy Walsh, now a successful rancher himself, talked about how Daniel's fair wages and respect had given him dignity when his family had been at their lowest point. Sarah Patterson, one of the students Rebecca had helped, now a teacher herself, spoke about how Rebecca's generosity had kept her in school and changed the trajectory of her life. Michael Chen, who had become a doctor, described how Rebecca's support had made it possible for him to continue his education despite the discrimination his family faced. The stories went on for hours, each one a testament to the difference one person's generosity could make, and how that generosity multiplied when shared with the right person. Rebecca and Daniel sat together, holding hands, moved by the realization of how their decision to help each other had affected so many lives. When it was finally time for them to speak, Daniel stood and pulled Rebecca up beside him. "I am not much for speeches," he said. "But I want to say that 30 years ago, I met a woman who showed me what real courage looked like. It is not about facing down danger or proving how tough you are. Real courage is giving when you have little, sharing when you could keep it all for yourself, and believing that people are worth investing in even when the return is uncertain." He turned to Rebecca. "You taught me that. You showed me that security is not about hoarding resources, but about building community. You showed me that the best investment is always in people, not property. Everything good in my life started the day I decided to share what I had with you, because you were already sharing everything with others." Rebecca wiped away tears. "And you showed me that I did not have to destroy myself to help others. You taught me that accepting help is not weakness, and that working together we could do so much more than either of us could alone. You saw my dream and did not just support it, you helped me expand it beyond anything I had imagined." They kissed, and the town erupted in applause. It was a moment of pure joy, a celebration not just of a marriage but of what that marriage had meant for an entire community. As they grew older, Rebecca and Daniel's love remained the foundation of everything they did. They worked together on the ranch, though they gradually hired help to manage the more physically demanding tasks. They spent time with their grandchildren, telling stories and passing on the values that had guided their lives. They supported their children's work and took pride in seeing the legacy of generosity continue into the next generation. One spring evening, when they were both in their 60s, they sat on their porch watching the sunset. It was where they had shared so many important moments, where they had fallen in love, where they had made plans and dreamed dreams. "You ever regret it?" Daniel asked. "Giving up teaching to marry me, the life you might have had if you had stayed in town." Rebecca did not hesitate. "Never. Not for a single moment. Teaching was important, but this life we built together has been so much more than I could have done alone. Our children are changing the world in ways I never could have, and I have been blessed to spend every day with a man who truly sees me and loves me." "I am the one who has been blessed," Daniel said. "You took a cowboy focused only on survival and taught him how to really live. You showed me that the point of security is not to hoard it, but to use it to help others. You gave me a family, a purpose, and a love I never imagined I deserved." "We gave each other those things," Rebecca corrected gently. "That is what partnership means. We each brought something important, and together we created something neither of us could have built alone." As the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, they sat in contented silence. Behind them, the ranch house held decades of memories. Around them, the land they had worked together stretched toward the horizon. And ahead of them, they knew, were more years of love and partnership, of working together to make their corner of the world a little bit better. They had started with a teacher sharing her wages with poor pupils, and a cowboy who learned of her generosity and shared his entire life. From that simple beginning had grown a love story that transformed not just two lives but an entire community, rippling forward through generations. Years later, when they were both in their 70s, they would look back on their life together with deep satisfaction. Their children were successful and happy, raising families of their own with the same values of generosity and compassion. Their grandchildren were growing up in a California that was changing and modernizing, but carrying forward the lessons about community and caring for others that Rebecca and Daniel had modeled. The ranch remained profitable, though Daniel had gradually turned over most of the day-to-day operations to trusted managers. Rebecca's tutoring had evolved into an informal school for adults, where she taught reading and mathematics to immigrants and others who had never had the chance for education. Together, they had established a foundation that funded scholarships and supported schools throughout Northern California. But more than any of their external achievements, what mattered most was the love they still shared. It had deepened and matured over the decades, becoming something unshakable. They had weathered droughts and economic downturns, illness and loss, the normal challenges of a long life together. Through it all, they had remained partners in the truest sense, supporting each other and working together toward common goals. One morning, Rebecca woke to find Daniel watching her with a soft smile. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how lucky I am," he said. "I spent my youth thinking luck was about gold strikes and good fortune, but real luck is finding the person who makes you better than you ever thought you could be. Real luck is building a life that matters, with someone who shares your values and your dreams." Rebecca reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture so familiar it was almost unconscious. "I used to think my life would be about sacrifice," she said. "About giving up my own happiness to help others, but you showed me that helping others and being happy are not opposites. In fact, they go together. Sharing my life with you has been the greatest joy I have ever known, and it has also allowed me to help so many more people than I ever could have alone." "We are a good team," Daniel said simply. "The best," Rebecca agreed. As they sat together in the morning light, holding hands and looking forward to whatever the day would bring, they embodied everything that was good about love in its fullest form. Not the passionate rush of young romance, though they had known that too, but the deep contentment of two people who had chosen each other every day for decades, who had worked together, dreamed together, and built something lasting together. Their story had started with a simple act of compassion, a teacher sharing her small wages with students who needed help. It had grown when a cowboy recognized that generosity and responded by offering not just money but his whole heart, his partnership, his commitment to building a life dedicated to something beyond mere survival. And it had flourished into a love story that touched hundreds of lives, creating ripples that would continue long after they were gone. In the end, that was the real miracle of their story. Not that they had found love, though that was miraculous enough, but that their love had become a force for good in the world, transforming not just their own lives but the lives of everyone around them. They had proved that generosity and love were not weaknesses but strengths, and that sharing what you had, whether wages or life itself, was the truest path to happiness. As they entered their final years together, Rebecca and Daniel remained active and engaged with their community. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, as well as friends and community members whose lives they had touched. At the celebration, Will stood to toast his parents. He was in his late 40s now, distinguished and successful, but when he spoke about Rebecca and Daniel, his voice held the same warmth it had when he was a child. "My parents taught me that wealth is not measured in land or gold," he said. "It is measured in the lives you touch and the good you do. They showed me that the purpose of success is not to separate yourself from those who have less, but to lift others up with you. Everything I have achieved, everything our family has built, flows from the example they set and the values they lived." Clara spoke next, her voice strong and clear. "Mother and father showed me that one person can make a difference. Mother started by sharing a few dollars with hungry students. It was a small act, but it mattered to those children. Father saw that generosity and responded with generosity of his own. Together, they built something that has outlasted them, that continues to grow and help people. That is the definition of a life well lived." As the toasts continued, Rebecca leaned into Daniel's side, feeling his arm come around her shoulders in a gesture that had comforted and supported her for 5 decades. "Did we do well?" she whispered to him. "We did magnificently," he whispered back. "Look at what we created together. Not just children and grandchildren, though they are wonderful, but look at the community around us. Look at the people whose lives are better because of what we started. Look at the legacy of generosity that continues." Rebecca smiled, her eyes bright with tears. "It all started with you deciding to hire a teacher to do your bookkeeping. It started with a teacher who had such a generous heart that a cowboy could not help but fall in love with her," Daniel corrected. "Everything good in my life flows from that love." They celebrated late into the evening, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived fully and well. As the party finally wound down and guests began to depart, their children and grandchildren gathered around them for a final family photograph. Looking at the faces of the people they loved most in the world, Rebecca and Daniel felt a profound sense of peace and completion. The years that remained to them were gentle. They spent quiet days at the ranch, enjoying the simple pleasures of each other's company. They took walks through the property, remembering the early days when everything had been a struggle, grateful for the prosperity and peace they had achieved. They read together in the evenings, discussed ideas and news, and continued to engage with the community even as age limited their physical activities. Daniel passed away peacefully at the age of 82, with Rebecca holding his hand. His last words to her were, "Thank you for sharing your life with me. It was the greatest gift I ever received." Rebecca grieved deeply but not hopelessly. She had been blessed with 5 decades of love with a man who had valued her, supported her, and worked beside her to create something meaningful. She lived for another 3 years, spending time with her children and grandchildren, continuing to mentor and teach, and keeping alive the legacy of generosity that had defined her life. When she passed, the town of Yreka mourned the loss of a woman who had touched so many lives. At her funeral, person after person stood to share stories of how Rebecca Norton Sawyer had helped them, encouraged them, or believed in them when no one else did. The common thread in all the stories was generosity, the willingness to share not just money but time, attention, and love with anyone who needed it. Will and Clara arranged for their parents to be buried together on the ranch they had loved, under an oak tree where they had often sat together. The headstone was simple, bearing their names, dates, and a single line. They shared everything and built a legacy of love. The ranch passed to Clara, who continued to maintain it while expanding her school work. Will and his wife moved back to Yreka to be closer to family, and he opened a law practice focused on serving families who could not afford expensive attorneys. Together, the siblings continued their parents' work, guided by the example Rebecca and Daniel had set. The scholarship fund that Rebecca and Daniel had established continued to grow, eventually becoming a full foundation that funded education initiatives throughout California. The school Clara had opened expanded to multiple locations, each one providing not just education but comprehensive support to students from struggling families. And the grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried forward the family tradition of generosity and service, each finding their own way to make a difference in the world. Decades after their deaths, people in Yreka still told the story of the teacher who shared her wages with poor pupils, and the cowboy who learned of her generosity and shared his entire life. It had become a local legend, a reminder that one person's decision to help others could ripple forward through generations, creating change far beyond anything they could have imagined. But for those who had known them, Rebecca and Daniel were not just a legend or a moral tale. They were real people who had loved deeply, worked hard, and chosen to live their lives in service to something greater than themselves. They had proved that true wealth was not in what you kept but in what you gave, and that the best investment was always in people. Their love story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It was something better, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to making the world around them better. It was a love that grew stronger over decades, that weathered challenges and celebrated victories, that created a family and a community legacy. And at its heart was a simple truth that both Rebecca and Daniel had understood from the beginning, that giving generously opens your heart to receiving love, and that sharing your life with the right person multiplies all the good you can do in the world. The story of Rebecca Norton and Daniel Sawyer became part of the fabric of Yreka, California, a reminder of what was possible when generosity met love, when compassion inspired partnership, and when two people decided that building a life together meant building something that would outlast them both. Their legacy lived on in the schools that bore their names, in the foundation that funded countless students' educations, in the family that continued their work, and most of all, in the memory of a love that had transformed not just two lives but an entire community. From the simple act of a teacher sharing her meager wages with hungry students, and a cowboy who saw that generosity and responded by offering his whole heart and life, had grown something remarkable and lasting. It was a testament to the power of love, the importance of generosity, and the truth that the best things we build in this life are not made of wood or stone but of compassion, partnership, and the decision to share ourselves fully with others. In the end, theirs was a story that proved what Rebecca had told young Will all those years ago. Money is just a tool, and what matters is what you do with it. But even more than that, it proved that love, when given freely and received gratefully, becomes the foundation for everything good that follows. Rebecca and Daniel had given each other the gift of partnership, had built a life of meaning and purpose together, and had created a legacy that would continue blessing others long after they were gone. It was, in every sense, a life well lived and a love well shared. And that, in the end, is the greatest achievement any person can hope for.